On the other side of Charleston, Sophie Blake hadn't left her house in 3 days. The mail was piling on the windowsill, her sketchbooks untouched, the tea in her favorite mug still sitting cold. She used to be a designer, textures, colors, spaces full of light, but now she avoided mirrors. Since her mother passed away in that same house, every room echoed like a funeral parlor. At 4:07 p.m., every single afternoon, a boy across the street would sit by his window and draw her. Noah Green, 11 years old, thin as a lamppost, curls always, messy eyes, too quiet for his age. He didn't know her name, but he liked the sadness on her porch. He understood it. His mom worked night shifts at the hospital. His dad, he'd stopped asking. But every day, he'd sketch something outside Sophie's house, her watering dead flowers, her picking up the mail but never opening it. And recently, a dog he'd never seen before, a golden figure sitting quietly behind the screen door, watching the same world Noah drew. Before we begin this unforgettable story, would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments? And if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move you, please give this video a like and consider subscribing. Charleston, South Carolina, late autumn. The sky was overcast with a thin film of gray clouds. The air smelled of wet pine and salt from the nearby coast. The Greenwood Pines Animal Shelter sat at the edge of Charleston's historic district, nestled between a row of aging oaks and forgotten railroad tracks. It had once been a train depot long before someone repurposed it into a haven for abandoned pets. The cement floors still echoed like the sound of freight in the cold months, and today was no exception. The chill seeped in through the cracks, mingling with the sharp scent of disinfectant and the faint metallic tang of rust. In the farthest corner of Kennel Row, in a pen slightly larger than the others, lay Rusty. Rusty was a 9-year-old golden retriever with a thick coat that had dulled over time from vibrant honey gold to a pale, aging wheat. His once feathery tail now curled limply around his side, and his soft brown eyes, once alert and eager, stared blankly at the wall. He had a slight limp on his front right leg, a remnant of slipping on icy steps during his last winter with the man who once called him family. That man, Walter Greeley, had been Rusty's world. A retired postman with a fondness for Sinatra and quiet walks through the neighborhood, Walter lived alone in a small house on Magnolia Street. Rusty had been his only companion, a steady presence during Walter's later years. When Walter passed away the previous spring after a sudden stroke, no one in the family wanted to take in an old dog with a limp. So they handed Rusty over to Greenwood Pines with a box of expired treats and a blanket that still smelled faintly of the man he loved. That smell had faded months ago. Rusty no longer barked when people passed. He no longer lifted his head when a leash jingled. He had stopped pressing his nose through the bars or wagging his tail when volunteers came through with soft voices and gloved hands. He had tried in the beginning. He had hoped. But time in a cage teaches even the kindest dogs to go quiet. Meanwhile, just a few miles away, in the heart of Charleston's Crescent Park neighborhood, Sophie Blake stood barefoot in the center of her late mother's living room, surrounded by color swatches and floor plans, yet utterly uninspired. Sophie was 32, slender with long auburn hair usually tied back in a loose braid. Her skin was fair cheeks, often kissed red by the South Carolina sun when she remembered to step outside. There was a softness in the way she moved, though, lately. That softness had dulled into something brittle. The grief hadn't struck like lightning, it had crept in slow and heavy, like the way moss blanketed her mother's favorite garden bench. Since her mother passed away 3 months ago from pancreatic cancer, Sophie had drifted through her days like a leaf in water. She worked from home as a freelance interior designer, but her projects sat unfinished, her sketchbook untouched. Today, she had left the house out of instinct more than intention. She told herself she was looking for rustic textures and imperfect inspiration for a coastal home remodel. In truth, she didn't know what she was looking for, which is how she found herself standing in front of Kennel Center 27 at Greenwood Pines, her eyes fixed on the quiet form of an aging golden retriever curled like a question mark in the back corner. She hadn't intended to stop. In fact, she'd been walking the rows absent-mindedly, her camera hanging from her neck, snapping random shots of peeling paint and chain-link patterns. But something about Rusty, the stillness of him, the way he didn't even look up, made her pause. A volunteer walked by. She was a college-aged woman with tired eyes and rubber gloves. "That's Rusty," she said, following Sophie's gaze. "He's one of the long-timers." Sophie crouched slightly, careful not to make sudden movements. She looked closer. Rusty had patches of gray along his muzzle, and his left ear had a small notch, probably from scratching too hard. His coat was clean but flat, and when he finally turned his head to glance at her, it was with a look that held no expectation. "Why hasn't he been adopted?" Sophie asked, her voice almost a whisper. "He's old," the volunteer said gently. 9, maybe 10. People come in wanting puppies or small breeds. Rusty's a sweetheart, but he's, easy to overlook." Sophie didn't respond. She just kept looking at him. Something in her chest stirred a kind of ache, familiar but unspoken. Back on Crescent Park Lane, across the narrow driveway beside Sophie's house, Noah Green, 11 years old, sat on his upstairs windowsill with a sketch pad balanced on his knees. He was a small boy with a mess of light brown curls and a habit of chewing the sleeves of his hoodie. His world was quiet, not because he liked it that way, but because it had always been so. His mother, Rebecca Green, was a trauma nurse who worked double shifts at the hospital. She loved Noah fiercely, but she had very little time to show it. His father had left years ago, a silent exit, a man-shaped absence Noah had long since stopped asking about. Noah had noticed Sophie a few weeks ago. She moved into the Blake house not long after her mother's funeral, though she didn't talk to the neighbors. But he'd seen her out in the garden some mornings, watering the dying hydrangeas, or sitting on the porch steps with her head resting in her hands. He didn't know her name, not yet, but he had started drawing her anyway. Sophie with her camera. Sophie brushing dirt from her jeans. Sophie staring off at something invisible. This afternoon, as clouds rolled in above Charleston and the wind picked up faintly from the east, Noah drew again. His pencil moved in quiet lines, not of Sophie this time, but of a dog. A big, soft-looking dog curled up in a corner with eyes that seemed to know things no child could put into words. He didn't know why he drew it, just that it felt right. Back at the shelter, Sophie was still staring at Rusty. The volunteer had walked off, called away to another kennel, leaving her alone, with the sound of barking and her own racing thoughts. She pressed a hand to her chest. It was irrational. She hadn't come here to adopt. She wasn't even sure she could take care of herself, let alone a dog. But still, she reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. Not to make a call, just to take a picture. As she knelt to frame the shot, Rusty finally raised his head, not all the way, just enough to meet her eyes. It lasted a second. Then he lay back down. It was enough. Sophie didn't take the photo. She stood slowly, her heart pounding harder than it had in weeks. She didn't say a word. She simply walked to the front desk, and Rusty, back in Kennel Center 27, closed his eyes again, but for the first time in months, not from weariness. From peace. The afternoon light was dimming by the time Sophie pulled into her driveway on Crescent Park Lane, the soft hum of her hybrid SUV fading into the stillness of the residential street. Autumn had turned the trees copper and rust, and dry leaves fluttered across the sidewalk like whispers. Rusty sat in the back seat, unmoving. His body was steady, but his eyes tracked every small sound, the creak of tires over gravel, the soft thud of the car door closing, the rustle of wind brushing past the porch steps. His leash hung loose in Sophie's hand, but he made no move to resist. He didn't move at all. Sophie Blake, now standing on the porch with one hand on the screen door, glanced back at him. She wore a gray wool cardigan, sleeves pushed to her elbows, and jeans that dusted her ankles with mud from the shelter's parking lot. Her expression wasn't one of excitement nor pity. It was something quieter, curious, protective, and a little unsure. She'd never owned a dog before. Rusty, as if sensing her hesitation, exhaled deeply and lowered his head. "Come on, Rust," she murmured softly. "This is home." Inside, the house smelled faintly of cinnamon and old paint. Sophie had lit a scented candle earlier that morning, something she did out of habit, now a way to mask the silence. The living room was open and warm, with wood floors, mismatched throw pillows, and a large woven rug beneath a second-hand coffee table. In the far corner near the fireplace sat a new dog bed she had bought online the night after she saw Rusty. It was plush, rectangular, covered in soft faux sheepskin. She hadn't known what size to get, so she ordered the largest. Rusty paused at the threshold. His front paw hovered midair, unsure whether it was allowed past this invisible line. Sophie stepped back and gave him space. The leash loosened again, but she didn't tug. No commands, just patience. Eventually, his paw touched the hardwood, then the other. He walked inside with slow, deliberate steps, like someone entering a memory that didn't belong to them. His nose twitched, brushing the baseboards, pausing at corners. He passed by the dog bed and continued toward the sofa, but didn't attempt to climb it. Instead, he settled at a respectful distance beside the coffee table, curling into the same shape he had formed in his kennel, the shape of a dog trying to take up as little space as possible. Sophie didn't say anything. She stepped into the kitchen and returned with a ceramic water bowl, which she placed quietly a few feet away from him. Then she sat on the floor across the room, back against the armchair legs folded under her, and watched him with quiet awe. Outside, across the narrow driveway and behind slightly parted curtains, Noah Green pressed his forehead to his bedroom window. Noah had noticed the car pull up and the slow, deliberate way Sophie led the dog inside. He had seen big dogs before, mostly on TV or during walks in the park, but this one was different. He wasn't bouncing or barking. He looked tired, old, like a knight that had come home from battle but left his armor behind. Noah picked up his sketch pad from the nightstand and turned to a fresh page. Downstairs in his kitchen, his mother, Rebecca, stirred a pot of soup on the stove. A tall woman in her late 30s with ash-brown hair pinned into a messy bun, Rebecca was lean, quick-footed, and always half in motion. Her scrubs were still wrinkled from the hospital shift she had just finished. She wasn't one to sit long. Life had trained her to keep moving, first through med school, then through single motherhood, and now through a hospital ER that never slept. She glanced at the clock. It was past 6 p.m. She'd forgotten to remind Noah about dinner again. With a sigh, she turned down the stove and wiped her hands on a towel, then called up the stairs. "Noah, dinner's ready." "Okay," he called back, eyes never leaving the shape of Rusty, now curled beneath Sophie's window across the drive. Back in Sophie's living room, the candle had burned low. Rusty still hadn't touched the water. Sophie watched as he let out another breath, eyes flickering shut for a moment, then snapping open at the faint sound of a car horn in the distance. He didn't trust this silence. Not yet. She stood, brushing her hands on her jeans, and walked to the hallway closet. Pulling down a folded flannel blanket, she returned and set it gently near him, not touching him, not close enough to be intrusive, just there. Then, in a voice just above a whisper, she said, "You don't have to sleep in the bed. Just rest wherever feels safe." She went upstairs shortly after, leaving the living room dim and undisturbed. Rusty remained motionless for a while. Then slowly he shifted his weight, turned toward the blanket, and rested his chin upon it, not entirely on not claiming it, just acknowledging it. The wind outside had picked up. It rustled the hydrangeas beneath the porch railing and tapped tree branches lightly against the siding. Noah sat at his desk under the glow of a small lamp, finishing the outline of a dog curled next to a window. He gave the dog tired eyes. Not sad, just old, and waiting. When his mother came to check on him later, she found him asleep at his desk, pencil still in hand. The mornings in Charleston had turned sharper, the air tinged with the dry bite of coming winter. The light filtered through the bare branches outside Sophie Blake's window in muted shades of gold and gray. It had been 9 days since Rusty came home. Not adopted. Sophie never used that word aloud, as if it implied a certainty neither of them were ready for. No, Rusty had simply arrived, and in the quiet days that followed, the silence between them began to breathe. Rusty no longer hovered in corners. He had started lifting his head when Sophie entered a room, his ears twitching at the sound of her footsteps. Small gestures, tiny, almost imperceptible movements, but Sophie noticed. He now lay not at the far end of the room, but closer, just beside the couch, his body angled slightly toward her, as if listening without listening. Each evening, Sophie had fallen into a new habit. She would sit on the rug after dinner, cross-legged near Rusty, and speak. She didn't talk to him exactly, more like talking into the room, her voice low and melodic, like a memory being replayed. She told stories she used to tell her mother about old clients and ridiculous design requests, about a lamp that exploded during a remodel, or about a color swatch that had looked perfect in the catalog but turned out to resemble uncooked salmon. Rusty never responded, of course, but she found comfort in the rhythm of her own voice. One rainy afternoon, Sophie stood by the back door watching Rusty wander into the small garden. He sniffed at the damp soil, paused near a rosemary bush, and then trotted back with surprising ease, his gait still stiff, but more confident. She smiled. It was the first time he had gone outside without her prompting. Across the driveway, from the upstairs window of the greenhouse, Noah watched too. He had started spending more time by the window, not because he was spying, but because something about the quiet woman next door and her silent dog felt like pages in a book he hadn't read yet. He noticed how Sophie moved more, no less, like someone underwater, and more like someone waking up. And the dog Rusty had begun to look less like a statue, and more like something alive. That afternoon, Noah tucked his latest drawing under his arm and headed outside. He wore an oversized hoodie sleeves covering half his hands, and his sneakers were splattered with dried mud. As he walked past Sophie's gate, the wind kicked up and the pages of his sketchbook fluttered. Before he could stop it, one sheet came loose and caught in the breeze. It danced along the sidewalk like a leaf before landing just beyond Sophie's fence. Rusty was the first to see it. The wind had carried the drawing directly into the garden, where it settled face up near the rosemary bush. The image was unmistakable. Sophie seated, cross-legged, eyes closed in thought, and beside her, Rusty curled with his head on her knee. It was drawn with surprising accuracy. Every strand of her hair, every fold in the blanket she kept near the couch, captured with quiet detail. Rusty stepped forward, slowly sniffed the page, then picked it up between his teeth. Inside, Sophie was sipping lukewarm tea when she heard the click of paws on wood. She turned to find Rusty standing near the back door, a paper clutched gently in his mouth. Confused, she walked over and knelt to retrieve it. The drawing took her breath away. Her fingers traced the pencil strokes as she looked from the page to Rusty and back again. "Where did you get this?" she whispered. She didn't expect an answer, but his tail gave a small, uncertain wag. Moments later, Sophie crossed the driveway and knocked on the Greens' front door. The house was a simple 2-story with blue shutters and a slightly crooked porch swing. The door was opened not by Noah but by his mother Rebecca. Rebecca, still in her gray scrubs, and with exhaustion tucked into the corners of her eyes, blinked in surprise. She was tall and slender, her frame wiry from years of 12-hour shifts, and her presence was direct but not unkind. "Yes, hi, I'm Sophie. I live next door," Sophie said, holding up the sketch. "I think this might belong to your son. Rebecca," glanced at the drawing, recognition flashing in her eyes. "Oh, that's definitely Noah's. He's always sketching, mostly in secret. One of the few things that helps him stay grounded." Sophie nodded, then hesitated. "It's beautiful. I just wanted to return it." Rebecca looked at her for a long moment, something unspoken passing between two women who had each lost something invisible. Then she stepped aside. "Noah's upstairs. I'll call him." Noah appeared a minute later, wide-eyed, clutching the railing as he crept halfway down the stairs. He wore socks with holes and had pencil smudges on the side of his hand. When he saw Sophie holding his drawing, he froze. "I didn't mean to," he started. "It's okay," Sophie interrupted gently. "I just wanted to say thank you. It's the best anyone's ever drawn me." "Or Rusty." Noah blinked. "You named him Rusty." She smiled. "Yeah, it seemed to fit." He nodded, as if silently agreeing. Rebecca, watching from the kitchen doorway, raised an eyebrow. Sophie caught the look and took a step back toward the porch. "Well, I won't keep you," she said. "Just tell Noah it's amazing work." As she turned to leave, Noah called out, "Does he like stories?" Sophie paused, surprised. "Rusty." Noah nodded. "I thought maybe you read to him." That's what it looked like. Sophie's lips curved slightly. "Yeah, every night." Noah smiled. Not a full smile, just a small one, the kind that passed like a whisper. And as Sophie walked back to her house, she didn't realize that Rusty had been watching from the front window, tail gently tapping against the floor. The park was small and unassuming, tucked behind a quiet stretch of Charleston homes where the sidewalks cracked beneath the weight of mossy oaks. On weekends, the playground rustled with children's laughter, and on weekday mornings it served as a haven for joggers and the occasional dog walker. It had become a new part of Rusty's world, one that he had cautiously stepped into just as he had cautiously stepped into Sophie's home. Rusty, with his golden fur slowly regaining its softness, and his gait less hesitant with each outing, walked beside Sophie on a cool Saturday morning. The leash hung slack between them. She wore an old olive-green coat and sneakers spattered with dew, her hair tied into a bun with stray curls escaping like vines. Rusty paused by a bench near the path, sniffing the leg of the wood, then looked up as a jogger passed by. He didn't flinch. Sophie noticed. She smiled. It had taken weeks to reach this point, leaving the house without coaxing, walking past strangers without shrinking back, and even on rare magical occasions wagging his tail when someone spoke kindly to him. Today was one of those days. A little girl, no more than 6, with wild red curls and a ladybug backpack passed them on the trail. She gasped at the sight of Rusty and reached out instinctively. Her mother, a round-faced woman in gym tights and a pink hoodie, moved to stop her, but Rusty had already lowered his head gently, allowing the child to pat the top of his ears. "He's soft," the girl whispered, "like a toasted marshmallow." Sophie laughed. "He's been working on his fluff." Rusty's tail thumped the grass twice. Progress. But later that afternoon, as clouds rolled in and the wind picked up again, everything shifted. Sophie had just finished rinsing paintbrushes in the kitchen sink when she heard a faint knock at the front door, 3 soft taps, like someone unsure whether to interrupt. She wiped her hands and opened it. There, on the porch step, sat Noah. He wore a gray hoodie, 2 sizes too large, and clutched his sketchbook to his chest. His cheeks were streaked with drying tears, and his eyes, usually quiet, Observant were Glassy and Red. Rusty, who had been napping near the door, rose without hesitation and stepped out. Sophie knelt. Noah. What happened? He didn't speak at first. He just sat down on the step, his small frame hunched forward, hands trembling slightly. Finally, in a cracked whisper, he said, "My mom's in the hospital." Sophie's breath caught. What happened? She was in a car accident. A guy ran a red light. She's okay, I think. They said it wasn't too bad. But she's staying overnight and I didn't know where to go. Sophie felt a surge of something fierce and maternal rise inside her. She hadn't prepared for this, no guidebook, no plan, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "You did the right thing coming here." Rusty moved closer, nudging Noah's side with his snout, then gently laid his head on the boy's knee. Noah didn't flinch. He looked down at Rusty, blinked once, and for the first time that day he smiled. It was faint, barely there, but real. That evening the house didn't feel empty. Sophie made grilled cheese and tomato soup. She asked Noah if he wanted to call the hospital and speak to a nurse. He shook his head. She didn't push. Instead, she placed a blanket on the couch, found an old animated movie on TV, and brought out a mug of cocoa topped with marshmallows. Noah ate quietly, still hugging his sketchbook while Rusty lay curled at his feet like a sentinel. Later, Sophie called the hospital herself and confirmed that Rebecca was stable, resting, and should be home by morning. She didn't tell Noah this right away, only once he'd fallen asleep on the couch, his head tilted back, mouth slightly open, breathing steady. Rusty didn't move the entire night. The next morning, with Rebecca's discharge confirmed, and Sophie driving Noah to pick her up, the house felt different. The silence was no longer lonely. It had softened like a coat worn down by time. There were traces of laughter, the warmth of shared space, the scent of cocoa still lingering in the air. When Rebecca stepped out of the hospital entrance, she looked pale but alert. Her arm was in a sling, and a strip of gauze ran across her forehead, but her eyes, sharp, searching, landed on Noah before anyone else. He rushed into her arms. Behind them, Sophie stood by her car, Rusty, sitting beside her with his leash loose but secure. Rebecca looked at them with a mix of gratitude and exhaustion. "You kept him safe," she said quietly. Sophie nodded. "He kept himself safe. And he helped me, too." Rebecca gave a small, tired smile. "Looks like that dog's saving more than one life." That evening, after dropping them off and exchanging promises of staying in touch, Sophie returned home. She kicked off her shoes, lit a candle out of habit, and sat down on the floor beside Rusty. "You did good today," she said, scratching behind his ear. Rusty sighed and laid his head on her lap. And somewhere across the street, behind a second-story window, Noah began to draw again. This time, a picture of Rusty, lying between two figures, one with hair pulled back in a bun, one with a hoodie and a pencil in his hand. The door between them had never truly been locked. Charleston wore the early signs of December like a shawl, cooler. Breezes curling through the palmettos wreaths hung on porch railings and sunlight that seemed softer, more thoughtful. It had been just over a month since the night Noah had sat crying on Sophie's porch, and since then everything subtly, quietly had changed. Noah was back at home now, across the driveway in the blue-shuttered house with his mother Rebecca. She had recovered well from the car accident, her forehead scar fading to a soft silver line just beneath her hairline. The sling had been discarded weeks ago, and though she still winced when lifting heavy grocery bags, she carried herself with her usual brisk, don't-worry-about-it stride. Each day after school, Noah would cut across the driveway, sketchbook tucked under his arm, and knock twice on Sophie's side door. He didn't ring the bell. He never had to. Rusty was always the first to greet him, no longer tentative, no longer the quiet observer in the corner. At nearly 10 years old, the golden retriever still moved with the deliberateness of age, but now his tail wagged with certainty. His steps had purpose, and his eyes, once dimmed by time and loss, held a warmth that had returned slowly like the morning sun through thick fog. Sophie, too, had shifted. Her skin had color again. Her hair, once left to fall carelessly, was now often tied with a colorful scarf, and her voice had regained its playful cadence. She had returned to her design work not with desperation, but with clarity. Her next project was a coastal cottage renovation on the Isle of Palms. For inspiration, she brought her camera and Rusty along on beach walks, capturing textures in driftwood and the soft folds of dune grass. In the afternoons, while Sophie reviewed floor plans, Noah and Rusty would sprawl on the living room floor. Noah drew. Rusty dozed occasionally, rolling onto his side, his breathing deep and unhurried. The house had taken on a rhythm, quiet but full. One afternoon, Sophie brought home a new piece of furniture, a vintage sideboard she found at a local estate sale. It was scratched along one leg and smelled faintly of cedar. She spent the morning sanding it in the garage while Rusty lay nearby, his nose twitching at the dust. Later that evening, when Noah came over, he found her buffing the final coat of oil into the wood. "It's for the entryway," she explained, "but I think I'll leave a corner free for your drawing." Noah paused mid-step. "The one with Rusty and us," Sophie said with a smile. Noah handed her the rolled paper. It was the most detailed piece he had ever finished. Sophie stood in the center, one hand on Rusty's back. Noah was to her right, holding a pencil like a sword, and Rusty sat between them, ears alert, tail sweeping the floor in soft arcs. Behind them was her house, the porch, the open door, the garden bench now half covered in leaves. Sophie didn't frame the drawing right away. She sat with it for a while, holding it on her lap, studying every line as if it were a photograph of something too precious to forget. That night was unusually cold. The wind shook the loose branches outside, and a chill settled into the floorboards. Sophie made chamomile tea. Noah, wrapped in a plaid blanket, sat on the armchair by the fire legs, tucked under him, sketchbook closed. Rusty lay curled at Sophie's feet, his head resting on her slipper eyes, half-lidded in contentment. They didn't speak much. There was no need to. The room was heavy with comfort, the kind that didn't ask questions or fill silence with sound. Just presence. As the fire dimmed and the hour grew late, Sophie looked at the boy slouched in the chair and the dog dozing beside her. And in that moment she knew. The house, once filled with the absence of her mother, had been quietly rewritten. Not to erase the past, but to hold it gently while making room for the now. She whispered aloud, almost to herself, "Finally, I'm home." She looked toward the far wall, the one above the fireplace where a faded photo of her mother once hung. In its place now, with care and ceremony, she had pinned Noah's drawing. It wasn't just art, it was a declaration. The next morning, she awoke to the scent of cinnamon toast and the sound of Rusty's paws tapping lightly across the floor. Noah had already gone home the night before, but the sense of him lingered like a familiar melody. Outside, the city stirred awake. Rebecca stepped onto her porch with a mug of coffee and a thick scarf wrapped twice around her neck. She waved across the driveway. Sophie waved back. It no longer felt like waving to a neighbor. It felt like waving to family. And Rusty, now standing at the window with his nose pressed to the glass, watched it all, his home, his people. His second chance wrapped in golden light. Sometimes the smallest acts, an open door, a warm glance, a silent dog choosing to trust again, are where God hides his greatest miracles. Rusty wasn't just a dog left behind. He was a quiet reminder that healing doesn't always come in grand gestures, but in patience, love, and the willingness to show up every day for someone who needs us. Just like Sophie found a family when she thought she had lost everything, and Noah discovered connection through unexpected kindness, we too are offered these divine moments in our own lives if we keep our hearts open. Maybe you are someone's miracle in waiting, or maybe you're still waiting for yours. Either way, don't lose faith. Because sometimes, when we think the door is closed forever, God gently unlocks it. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to share it. Comment your thoughts and subscribe to our channel for more stories that honor the quiet power of love and second chances. And if you believe in the beauty of healing, type Amen in the comments to say a prayer for all the forgotten souls still waiting for home. May God bless you and all those who are still searching.